I was actually thinking about this again recently, that a number of objections to universalism seem to more be uh, arguments that are saying that these objections against eternal conscious torment or maybe against annihilation don't go through because of, let's say, the value of libertarian free will. Usually, as I was thinking about it, usually these aren't even posed as objections to universalism, although sometimes they are, and I have seen them posed as objections. But usually I see them more as almost like maybe undercutting a certain kind of objection to eternal conscious torment. But as I think about the value of free will, one way in which you could argue against universalism through the value of free will is you would say that it's a great value that every being be able to choose whether to love God, and that that choice of whether to love God implies a choice to be able to be separated from God. Because if you don't love God, if you think of God as the good, the locus of the good, then you're sort of in a sense not loving the good. Even if you don't characterize it as God, you're moving away from the good. And that moving away from the good leads to a kind of separation from the good. And that experience of separation from the good, you could consider that sort of negative, and at its most extreme levels, it becomes what you might think of as hell, a hellish experience. Whereas if you think that everybody is ultimately going to be reconciled to God, you might think that that challenges this idea that we actually have that free will to be separated from God. Because I mean, how is God going to achieve this reconciliation if certain people freely choose not to be reconciled? How can God do that unless he sort of forces us to love him? And then you might think that's not real love, or that's not the kind of valuable love that we want. And so that's going to violate that libertarian free will. So what I'm doing here is I'm now sketching how you could use that libertarian free will argument, the value of free will, as an argument against universalism. The idea is the only way God could achieve universalist reconciliation, where all are saved or in union with God and with the good, is through taking away libertarian free will. Okay, so that's kind of sets up the objection, because I think it's important for people to realize, there is this objection here, and if I'm going to respond to the objection, I want to first give a good version of it. I'm not saying this is the only version of the objection, but that would be one that I've heard quite a bit from free will. And let me just say that in response to this kind of objection, I have a few different things that I've been thinking about. One has to do with whether the value of free will is so valuable that there couldn't be some higher value where a perfect being would be motivated to provide some kind of constraints on that value. So for example, like if I think about giving my kids the freedom to play outside, that seems very valuable. They should have the freedom to play outside. Now imagine that I know that there's this hole outside, and this hole happens to be an infinitely deep hole, okay? It goes all the way down. If they fall in there, they're going to fall forever, and they'll actually never die. They'll just be consciously experience the pain of falling. And then I think, well, should I give them the freedom? They're even asking for it. Daddy, we want to play. It feels fun to play around that hole. It seems risky. We've got games and stuff. Well, given my knowledge of the stakes, I might say, well, I would say that the value of freedom in this case isn't worth the risk of falling and suffering forever in this particular case. And I think about that Bible verse, love always protects. Love always protects. So I think, well, I will give my children the freedom to do things, but the background is love and protection. So that even as I consider how they might use their freedom, I don't want them to have freedom that could result in eternal, everlasting, conscious torment and suffering. Okay, so I think about that. That sort of weighs in my mind as just a question about whether the value of freedom would sort of on its own be worth that cost of the risk of eternal conscious torment. Okay, now that's not a sort of a final thing to be said. The dialectic can continue along that line, but that's one consideration that weighs in my mind. A second consideration that weighs in my mind would be ways in which God could actually respect that freedom to choose, even to choose to not love God, but yet still achieve universal reconciliation in the long term. And one sort of simple way this might go is God never gives up, restoring opportunities for us to make choices. Now, I understand there is a sort of theology that once you've said no to God, you come to a place of being hardened and it's just too late. And some people consider some examples where it's like you're in this, there's a chasm that separates you from God, and this shows that the story's over, and there's no way to be given another chance. But then when I think about this just as a parent, it seems like there's all sorts of examples where the free choices of my children result in consequences that for a stage of time means that they can't have certain things that they might want, certain things that I might even want for them because of the consequences of their choices. So even though there can be sort of a chasm or a barrier to certain goods, that's possible. It doesn't follow that that barrier has to be there forever, and that an omnipotent being with all the resources couldn't restore an opportunity for choice. And then my thought is that over time, with enough choices, there's enough opportunities so that probably everybody would eventually turn towards the good. That's sort of one idea. Another idea is that God, now this again depends on your background theology, because if you think God has foreknowledge of free creatures before he even creates them, then you have resources for making an argument that God could make use of that foreknowledge. And among all the infinite possible people, God could select any arbitrary finite number of people to create whom he knows would freely not reject him for all of eternity, but would eventually come into reconciliation. And so that would be sort of another way in which, even with free will, it's not even clear to me that that would show that there wouldn't be even a high probability of universal reconciliation. So there's a lot there, and those are kind of maybe, let's say, opening pathways. One pathway being that maybe there's higher values than just the value of freedom. Love always protects. And then the other pathway being that maybe God would have the resources so that even respecting free choice can have a high likelihood of resulting in something that God desires, which is relationship that's healthy, not ultimately broken. So those would be kind of my responses to that argument from libertarian freedom.